Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special event, the opening act of the Norman Foster Institute on Sustainable Cities. I'm Tim Stonor, and it's my honor to be the chair through this morning when we're going to hear from 14 experts in the multiple different facets of sustainable cities: architectural design, material science, demographic analysis, community engagement, city governance, just to name a few. Our speakers are drawn from an even wider group that comprises the academic faculty of the Norman Foster Institute, who over the next 12 months will be teaching the scholars of the inaugural class. Now, on the wall in a moment are details of how you can join and share, if you wish to, this event online. There'll be a hashtag, there will be a handle for the Institute. It'll come up shortly. It may even be my job to make it happen. This is not my job. This is what's about to happen next. We've got much to get through today. I'm only going to be able to give the briefest of introductions to our guest speakers, but I therefore refer you to the literature in which you'll find their biographies and achievements in full, as well as further information on the Institute. So let's begin by welcoming to the stage the person whose creative curiosity, strategic foresight, and civic leadership forms the bedrock of the Institute, Norman Foster.
Thank you. Good morning. Why an institute? Why cities? Why sustainability? And why, given the successful program so far, still evolving, of the workshops, the summits, the think tanks, the answer, there are several answers, really is that it has grown out of this program. It's a natural evolution. Something that was 1 week as a workshop needed more time and has morphed into that. Also, it taps into the extraordinary network which has built up since we launched the foundation in 2017. An extraordinary network of individuals who've contributed generously their time, their wisdom, sharing that with scholars, the civic leaders of the future. Many of those individuals are here today, and the sponsors who supported those programs, and I'd like to say thank you and pay tribute to their generosity. So to state the obvious, but sometimes perhaps the obvious needs stating, cities really are our future. By 2050, 2 out of 3 will be living in cities, and the cities generate 90% of global wealth. And just to put into context the challenge of urbanization, which will not happen in this part of the world, but on the planet, we're talking about between now and 2050, something like creating 17 Madrids every year. That's the scale of the challenge. That's 90% of the population growth. 7 billion by 2050 will be living in cities. And, whoops, excuse me, jumping. They shouldn't do that. Anyway, slow down. And they generate 70% of global emissions. So they're at the forefront. They're the very key to combating climate change. And to paraphrase Winston Churchill about how we shape the environment, we could say that we shape our cities and they shape us. And cities are not static. They're being created in terms of new cities, and existing cities morph, they change, they grow. They require decisions. How are those decisions made? Are they going to be made rationally in terms of data and facts? Or are they going to be based on fashion or prejudice? And in terms of making decisions, will those decisions involve the communities who are affected by those changes and who can be participatory and trigger those changes? Or will they be top-down, imposed, and alienate the communities? Will the lessons of history be heeded, particularly in terms of the city beautiful, the traditions of the past, which are as valid today as they were in the past? You could say that all these issues are right at the heart of the Institute. They are about empowering and informing the civic leaders of the future. And in that sense, what kind of course can we create? And in what way is this course that we're launching different from existing courses, which are mainly in the domain of universities? And we're grateful to universities for the wealth of talent that they generate. But whether I'm a practicing architect and urbanist and I'm seeing the graduates from universities, or whether I'm talking as I do to many young people, there is a perceived disconnect. There is inevitably the opposite of the upside is the downside. There is a disconnect between academia and the real world. And so in this course, we seek to marry those. We integrate them. And at that point, we combine the best of academia with the best of hands-on experience. We're extremely fortunate to have as an academic partner the Autonomous University of Madrid, and I'd like to pay tribute to them also, because it's a great marriage for the future of this course. And so if we combine the classroom, the network of those extraordinary individuals, and they become mentors, and we combine that with the technology which is available today to be able to predict the consequences of design interventions, to be able to map, to create a virtual twin of a city. So we have invested, we have created this laboratory which is within walking distance of the headquarters, an integral part of the campus, a partnership with the engineering school next door as well. So that then is linked in to real-life projects with 3 selected pilot cities. So if you can imagine that we can predict, we can work with those cities, we can identify challenges. It may be a neighborhood, it may be a citywide strategy. We can explore the implications of that. The students can work on it as a project, engage with the mentors, and then at the end of the course, they present their findings to the city. So it's a partnership with the city, it's a partnership with different skills. And in this first iteration, the 3 cities are European: Athens, Bilbao, San Marino. The representatives are here today, and we're very grateful for their participation in that partnership together. For future iterations of the course, the methods that we will be adopting are applicable to cities globally, whether they're cities are Asian cities, whether they're Middle Eastern cities, Latin America. The philosophy, whether it's formal or informal, is in that sense universal. And there is a link to the United Nations through my role as advocate for cities, where I engage with mayors from North America, Europe, and Asia. And it's very important that cities do learn from each other. They share, and that forum of the City of Mayors is active in that. So there is an important link to the sustainability goals of the United Nations. There is another link to the MIT Media Lab. And Dava Newman, who's here today, who's the honorary dean of the Institute, we're very grateful for that participation, and also leading to a very important group within the Media Lab, which is the City Science Group headed out by Kent Larson. And Kent and his team there have pioneered a lot of the technology that I'm talking about in terms of interactive design. And Kent and I, we've worked together with the foundation over the years, and it's a kind of seamless collaboration. So we are co-directors of the course. And as we spent many hours together, we realized that we can jointly apply those skills to a whole range of cities. But perhaps we should challenge ourselves, the scholars, the mentors, by having a vision of what the ideal city is. It's a kind of balancing act. And so the ideal city we would advocate is one which is dense, compact, it's walkable, it's user-friendly. It's the opposite of the sprawling, car-borne city. It's likely to have neighborhoods which are mixed in use, zoning that permits the spontaneity, the unpredictability of city life, proximity between the walkability of where you might work, where you might be educated, where you might enjoy leisure. It's likely to be well connected by public transport. It's likely to be permeated by nature, ideally bringing biodiversity into everyday life. It's likely to have a historic core. Issues of culture, heritage will be promoted. It's an ideal utopian city. But in some ways, if we think about what I'm describing, perhaps it has a certain familiar ring. many of the attributes of that ideal city, which could be fed into the reality, excuse me, getting ahead of myself. It could be fed into many different kinds of cities. So if it has a certain familiar ring, and Madrid is walkable, it's pedestrian friendly, it does have a mix of uses, the zoning or lack of it does encourage a mix. So many of the kind of cities that I'm describing are familiar, and it's no accident perhaps that these cities regularly appear in polls of what are the most desirable places for people to visit as tourists or families to settle there and bring up children and a few. They span 3 continents, and they have the kind of ingredients that I'm describing as the compact city. And if we take aside what might have a popular appeal as a kind of city, and we just talk about the energy consumption of the compact city versus the sprawling city, then it's quite dramatic. It's almost twice the energy consumed. And I guess that, that when we look from above, we start to see that a city is not just the individual buildings, it's the connections, the parks, the green spaces, the bridges, the metro system. Some are hidden below ground, some are above ground. The infrastructure that determines the DNA of a city, its identity. And the course will focus on many of the traditional historic qualities of cities. I'm reminded of the importance of master planning by the Secretary General, who asked me if I would address the General Assembly on the importance of master planning. And that reminds me of Daniel Burnham, who was responsible for the master plan of Chicago in 1909. And his words, I think, have a certain resonance, not just about cities, but about the wider implications, perhaps, of education, of aspiration, of ambition. Make no little plans. Make big plans. Because a noble logical diagram will never die. Let your watchword be order, and your beacon be beauty. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman. We now have 3 further presentations from members of the teaching faculty, the first of whom is Kent Larson, who, with Norman, is co-director of the Institute, as well as City Science Group Director at MIT. Kent, the stage is yours. Click is there.
Well, thank you. It's been such an honor to work with Norman and his and Elena and the amazing team at the Norman Foster Institute. I'm so glad to be here for this opening day. And Friday, I had an opportunity, if I could get my slides up here. Here we are. To meet the scholars, amazing group of young people. Look forward to working with them. And they all realized that the world will be a totally different place when they're my age. I mean, we're looking at global warming at a pace that reflects the worst case scenarios. And I think that COP28, we should all realize that the chance that national governments will actually make the decisions that are required to address this challenge, and to address it, that means reducing CO2 emissions to about 2.5 tons of CO2 per person per year if we're to have an 80% chance of limiting global warming to 2 degrees centigrade. I think the chance of them doing that is essentially zero. So, but we can operate at different scales. National scale, I think governments are probably not up to the task. Of course, we have personal scale, but virtuous behavior makes a tiny difference. We should all do our part. There's a global scale, geoengineering in particular. I mean, I think we might get there, but right now it's highly risky. But of course, there's the urban scale, and as Norman said, 70% of global emissions are from cities, 90% of wealth creation, 90% of population growth. And the UN IPCC report says, how cities and towns are designed, constructed, managed, powered, essentially the whole process, will lock in, meaning you can't change it once it's built, behavior, lifestyle, future urban greenhouse gas emissions. So it's up to these young people to address that challenge. So we wanted to have a reality check. So we built a climate model, and we calculate that emissions in our backyard, Kendall Square, about 2.2 tons. Now, if we're to hit that goal, that means a 7x reduction. And we ask the question, what would that take? I mean, is it even feasible? So we took our climate model, we ran through a series of possible interventions. First of all, we just accepted the Massachusetts decarbonization roadmap. That saved less than a ton. We then said, what if everybody that commuted in every day drove electric vehicles? Because of the embodied energy of these vehicles, that actually doesn't do a whole lot. Then we said, what if half the people worked remotely? Well, it turns out people use more air conditioning, they drive more. That didn't do a whole lot. We're down to 15.7. Then let's retrofit, deep retrofit, all of the existing buildings. But again, you have so much embodied energy in these systems, it doesn't make a lot of difference. Then we said something radical. What if we actually build housing for the 42,000 people that commute in every day? That had a huge difference, but people still need access to the amenities, schools and shopping. So then we put all of that within 5 minutes in our model. Those two together had the greatest impact. We said, what if people lived in less space? So we use architectural robotics. This is a spin-off company from my group where beds disappear. You live with greater functionality in about half the space. That had some impact. Then we said, okay, will people live near where they work, have amenities? Let's use very lightweight mobility like our autonomous bicycle and others that we prototyped in our group. We're now down to about 8.4. Then we said, well, what if everybody ate a meatless diet? Okay, that actually had more impact than electric vehicles, amazingly. This is our city farm project. And then because we don't have enough wind and solar to power the city, let's use nuclear batteries available in the 30s, ultimately fusion in the 40s. Now we're at 5.9, but we're not at what? What are we going to? Yeah, 2.5. So we're not there yet. But these community scale interventions are what made all the difference. So ultimately, we can perhaps decarbonize air travel, the internet, local manufacturing. Maybe if we did all of that in an extreme way, we can get close to this 2.5. But what's particularly interesting is the community scale interventions where you don't only get an environmental benefit, you get a public health, a social, an economic benefit, increase the innovation potential of a community. So this is where I think we need to focus. I didn't realize Norman was going to show this image before, but this represents a community. We have this notion that the planet is becoming a network of cities, and successful, high-functioning cities will be a network of vibrant entrepreneurial communities. So what is the process that the students should go through? We have to start with insight, with data collection, data analytics. That alone, though, has no impact, but it's where you have to start. Then you identify all the interventions that can improve the current conditions. I talked about some of them, but there are lots of ideas out there. Which ones are important? So that requires prediction, the third step. Building the simulation models to get a sense of what the priorities should be. But even those three will not have impact unless you reach consensus. Bring businesses and government and citizens together to reach a shared vision of the future. And then I would argue that you still don't have impact unless you have enlightened government to have public policy that can facilitate that transformation. And then you have all of the systems that are required. I talked about some of them. I'm just going to mention one that I'm right now particularly excited about, which is dynamic zoning. So let me talk about zoning. It sounds like a boring issue, but I think it's actually the most exciting thing we're working on right now. And to give you a sense of what we're thinking, this is a natural ecosystem in harmony with all the feedback mechanisms that we learn about in high school. And for thousands of years, human settlements had similar kind of feedback mechanisms, and they were in harmony, what we call civic homeostasis. And then things became totally disrupted with the Industrial Revolution. We had centralized production and infrastructure and new mobility systems. But I would argue the biggest change can be dated to 1927. This is when the US Supreme Court validated zoning. And that happened to be the exact same year that the 15th millionth Model T Ford rolled off the assembly line. So the combination of zoning and inexpensive automobiles led to these vast monoculture housing districts and office districts, and it required moving millions and millions of people twice a day, large distances. Where we are now in Kendall Square was a product of the Industrial Revolution, and it became basically an office park. Almost nobody lives here, very little amenities. So we modeled that. So starting in 1980, you can see how office space, R&D space increasing, but the percentage of housing and amenities decreased. There's no feedback mechanism there. It's all market forces which don't have social feedback mechanisms. But there are new approaches to zoning. This is Mies van der Rohe's famous Seagram's building, and he did something very radical. He set the building back, created a plaza, so a few years later, with the new zoning, they said, well, let's give developers a bonus if they build a plaza overnight. Essentially, every developer put in plazas. This is a really powerful behavior change mechanism. So what we're looking at is dynamic algorithmic zoning, and so this hints at it. So with every new project, you recalculate the incentives, and you can create greater incentives for the amenities that you need. And this is all adjusted, and humans are in the loop, and over time, you can achieve something in equilibrium, like a natural ecosystem in harmony. And you can also do one more thing. You can allow humans to be in the loop. And so human intelligence, artificial intelligence, bring that together for extended intelligence, and humans then can have control of many of these issues, doing what they do best and allowing machines to do best, and we can take a percentage of that increased value and put it into an endowment that is shared with the community. And I think within a few years, architects will all be using these kinds of generative systems, highly personalized, to create this kind of very agile, responsive future. We're looking at this right now by building these kinds of theaters that allow for us to explore all these new tools. So these are some of the things the students will be thinking about. I hope we can break some new ground. So thank you all.
Thank you, Kent. Is everyone's brain full yet? we're just getting started. Our next speaker, Edgar Pieterse, is the founding director of the African Centre for Cities and the provost of the Norman Foster Institute, which sounds like a grand title. So all yours, Edgar.
Thank you so much, Tim and Helena and Norman. Thank you so much for the privilege and the honor of being part of this incredible experiment. And as soon as I know what provost means, I'll let you know. Thanks, journey of discovery. So I must confess, start with a confession of a bit of false advertising with the title of my talk. I'm not actually going to share with you any examples of innovation from the African continent. But what I am going to do is to try and share with you a set of frameworks that we are building across a community of practice to begin to make sense of the challenges. And it builds beautifully on the previous two presentations, because what I will do is to respond to that from an African context. And the first issue to understand is that none of what Kent has just shared is feasible or even conceivable in most African cities because of political and institutional constraints. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But one data point. So between now and that critical marker of 2050, when we should have achieved that 2.5 target in the frame that Kent has just presented, African cities in West, Central, and East Africa will treble in size. Now, that growth in and of itself is not so much the issue, but it is really the challenge of dealing with that whilst decarbonizing in the way that we've just seen in that fantastic visualization. If you have read the news recently, you'll know that we also need to attend to questions of peace and deal with the insurgence of political instability. We also have to figure out how to still conduct the industrial revolution, which has to be green by definition. And this has got to be achieved whilst we've got to push back against a set of global trading norms and global trading agreements that intentionally disadvantage African economies, let alone the challenge of corporate-driven digitalization. So the logics that drive these cities within which this growth is going to happen is mainly informal. And so policymakers, designers, urbanists need to contend with this reality of informality. Large and growing youthful populations that can't find formal and decent jobs, what they are able to get only gives them extremely low wages, but more challenging is the fact that not so much the wages is low, but it is precarious. You don't know from day to day what that income is going to be. And what that means effectively at a household level is that you cannot plan. You cannot invest in a systematic way. And so the only hustle that is available is slum urbanism, because that's how you minimize risk and cost, social reproductive cost. Now, of course, what this produces is a context of large-scale informality. So the existing urban population of Africa, which is 600 million, that's greater than the European urban population, that will treble. And 70% of the current urban population live informally and work informally. And so this, of course, intersects then with health, climate, and other economic shocks. So what we see is not political or urban dysfunction. We see an embedding of institutionalized inequality. Now, to respond to that and to apply the kind of tools that Kent has just taken us through means that we do need to take a historical perspective, and we've got to be systemic about it. So what we see when we try and respond to these questions is that there is a context of cascading governance failures, which clearly is connected to the colonial inheritance, which has produced this dysfunctionality, both in terms of political culture, but also institutional formats, which is inappropriate to context. The effect of that is that three big structural challenges: inequality, low wages, as I've just explained, and then, of course, this is reinforced by the way in which environmental and climate variability and distress reinforces pre-existing patterns of inequality. What this manifests in on the ground at this community scale is, of course, stunted socioeconomic development. So social mobility for these young people are simply not possible. What happens? What are their choices? And Alejandro will speak a little bit later about these peripheral conditions where this produces very particular economic and cultural logics. But what happens is that you see an intergenerational undermining of capabilities in the sense of Amartya Sen, but you also see an encoding of social conflict over very limited resources. And as a result, you've got limited collective action, and that's clearly what's needed for the kind of decision-making that Kent has just spoken about to take control of some of the investment decisions. And inherently, you've got a fundamental misallocation of capital. So in response to this is the second frame we've built, is that clearly, as we've just seen in that model and the contribution of the community scale, what that delivers, is you need integrative design. There's a whole typology of sustainable infrastructure technologies, whole new set of debates around green building and retrofitting, and of course, all refracted through the need to reimagine what placemaking involves so that it has well-being as an outcome and is consistent with nature-based solutions. So that's the agenda, that's what this cohort is being trained to do. But as we've just heard in terms of Kent's presentation, and we really didn't compare notes, is that if this doesn't align with a fundamental rethinking of the institutional dark matter of cities, which is zoning, which is planning, is regulatory reform, you're unable to achieve all of these potentialities. But of course, it's not just about the regulatory question. It always returns to the question of politics. And how do we build this different imagination to enable, of course, the kind of governance reform that's applied. Now, I do agree with Kent that I think the role that digital infrastructure platforms can play to animate this is profound. We're just beginning to scratch the surface to understand that. But if you get lost in that rabbit hole and you don't return to questions of cultural fabric and, of course, the structure of the multi-level governance system, it is very difficult to get these multi-scale interventions at the city scale right. So in thinking through this, it's important when we try and figure out what's the first move is to be very clear about the hierarchy of constraints. And one of the issues comes back to this question of control. Who controls these regulatory frames? What if the state doesn't have full authority and legitimacy over the city, over society? What if informal, criminal, illicit governance and regulatory frameworks is as important as formal state institutions? How do you begin to think this transition of infrastructure and built environment systems? How do you rethink questions of governance when they coexist? What about the role of traditional authorities in these cities who fulfill critical land use functions? And of course, how do you deal with the reality that most of the limited capital that comes into the cities is not just inappropriate and misallocated, but it also reinforces, in a path dependency sense, in a lock-in sense, a carbon-intensive urban fabric. That's the reality in most African cities today. And so to attend to that, we clearly need to think very differently about understanding the cities. So the digital twin option is going to be a little bit kind of stretch in most of the cities where I work. It would be amazing if we can have the labs there, so for future partners, Norman. But the point about it is that we're talking about cities that are reproduced through a series of improvisations. Constant improvisations by different actors whose governance logics don't align. And unless we are able to build the analytical tools to understand what those data points are, the different rationalities at play, how they compete, how they contest, it is very, very difficult to figure out what to do next. And so the challenge is not just to understand what is going on, but to be able to describe that in a way that we can begin to build a very different understanding than the derivative norm that is the case. And what I mean by a derivative norm is that at the moment, discourses around resilience, smart cities, the compact cities and so forth, the way they land in African cities is still derived from a Western assumption about urbanism. And we need the data to be able to tell a very different story about multiple urbanisms that are possible within a climate-constrained world. And for me, what this means is we always have to start with institutional priming. How do you prime different participatory practices, different institutional designs, and play with different institutional logics? Now, the way that I'm going about this is that I've brought together my peeps, as they say, from across the continent, people who are doing incredible work to instantiate these kinds of mindsets. And the reason for this is that I believe that all of us need to acknowledge that the future is where those red dots are, because the largest share of the population demographic transition we're talking about are going to be in those geographies. And unless we are able to create the enabling environment for forms of urbanism that can attend to their realities, we are lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar, for those provocations. Our final speaker before we have a panel is David Newman, an aerospace engineer, former deputy administrator of NASA, MIT academic, and honorary dean at the Norman Foster Institute. David.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elena and Norman, distinguished guests, and to the students. This is the most exciting day I can think of. Happy 2024. Let's get started. I'm going to ask you to open your minds a bit. Let's take a big, broad view. If I can click my slides, maybe. There we go. Next slide. I will take you out throughout the solar system and come back to Earth and the cities. So, for all of exploration, we have three fundamental questions. Are we alone? And I mean in the universe. And are there other habitable planets and future cities? And what about life elsewhere? So as you fly through this Hubble image, this is a Westerland 2 cluster. 3,000 new stars have been born. So I like to think about that in terms of scale and our place within the universe. Just think about that. 3,000 new stars. Help me with the next slide. Not an eye chart, but to scale. You see this little blue dot? Yeah, that's the pale blue dot. That's Earth to scale. We explore all of this. We've sent Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, our space probes. That's as far as humanity has ever gone. Our minds, our hopes, our envisions, but we think about way beyond. But here's Earth to astronomical unit scale. We're all astronauts. We're orbiting around our sun. So we really have to think about sustainable humanity, in my view. Not sure the business. So Spaceship Earth is my favorite planet by far. I am working on sending people to Mars, but it is not option B. Sorry, Elon. The most transformative photograph of the last century was to see Earth, Spaceship Earth, in its entirety, to realize that we have so much more to celebrate together. We don't see barriers, we don't see divisions, we see that we are all humanity and we have to get this right. We have to get this right. And it does, I think, take transformation to make sure that we're thinking about how we sustain life here on Earth. Because Earth and Mars, 4.5 billion years each, right? Spaceship Earth doesn't need us. We're a little bit of a nuisance, actually. It's going to be fine, just going to be fine, you know, if we're not here. So think about that when we think about how to be sustainable. It is living in balance with nature, all of our resources, and learning, I think, from ancient wisdoms of the past. So at the Media Lab, we are so happy to partner, to work together, to think about what we can do and how we can accelerate positive change with the Norman Foster Institute for sustainability. And we think it's through design and action. First and foremost, design, our data, our platforms we talked about, but most importantly, it's not ever going to be about our data and our information. It's going to be about changing hearts and minds. it's going to be about changing human behavior. That's really hard. You heard Kent talk about reimagining life and work and urban modeling and our simulations. I want to talk to you a little bit about, in the words of Bucky Fuller, Earth didn't come with an operating system. What can we do about that? Can we invent, can we think about Earth mission control? So these are the vital signs. I'd like to show you a few vital signs. We have thousands of Earth orbiting satellites. They are eyes on Earth. We're monitoring now in real time every aspect of Earth, all of our living systems. The land for agriculture. We can see into the oceans, our ocean currents. We can tell you about precipitation. All of Earth's systems, from oceans to land to air, again, eyes on Earth, looking down from space and monitoring. Here you see human-caused carbon dioxide. The yearly cycle of carbon dioxide. Northern hemisphere, where more of the population lives, you're looking at, and the green flashing, those are the carbon sinks. Thank goodness for the Amazon. Thank goodness for the ocean, because they're doing their job. They are absorbing as much carbon as they can, but it's out of balance. They can't keep up with the human-generated CO2 or other greenhouse gases. So we have to think about that. We have to think about what we can do, what we can all do to accelerate positive change for sustainability. So this is the global holistic view. I want to show you the global temperature history since we've been taking data. In 1880, we've been taking data for 144 years. Blue is 1 to 2 degrees Celsius below a 30-year running mean. Yellow and orange is 1 to 2 degrees Celsius above a running mean. You can raise your hand when you're born if you want. I like audience participation. So take a look at this. It's hot. We've just set the record. We just shattered records in 2023. We shattered a record each month this last year. But 2023, although it was the hottest year that we've ever recorded, it will be the coolest year of the next 100. So that's another way to look at it. This is the same data in a spiral looking from 1960s through 2003. So we're at that 1.17. As Kent mentioned, we blown right through 1.5. We can think about 2 degrees. In the northern hemisphere and the Arctic, the way it's melting is we're actually surpassing that already. But it's not gloom and doom. What can we do? But I want to just show you the data. Greenland and Antarctica. Again, I just returned from Antarctica. We were at the peninsula. Greenland and Antarctica hold 99% of the world's fresh water. It's melting. You see that? Over 400 gigatons per year. We measure the velocity of the melt. It causes sea level rise. If the Greenland ice sheet goes, that will amount to 6 meters of sea level rise. We're, at 20, 30 centimeters now. But it's an exponential. So we have got to stop the warming. This sea level rise, you might say, well, that's way up in Greenland or Antarctica. What does that have to do with me? No, well, it has everything to do with life in the cities, with the flooding in the cities, with the drought in the cities that we're experiencing. So take it from, kind of the poles down to the urban environments. And so what we think is necessary, is why didn't Earth get an embassy? I was in DC, we lived on Embassy Road, right? All the nations get represented. We forgot about Earth. We forgot about our own spaceship. So what about mission control? What about putting people in charge with agency to try to work together and get this right? So the operating system, and it's all about our students here in the Institute. It's all about the next generation, which I call the Earth ambassadors. So imagine yourself then surrounded here. You've seen the digital map tables. You're in charge. You have all of the data. Now what do you do with the data? So this is the kind of current version of the virtual reality experience where we're designing it. Again, the overview effect. You want to zoom into Earth to understand the fragility of Earth and that we're all here together. That thin, small blue atmosphere. You look at the atmosphere of Earth. If Earth was the size of a soccer ball, that atmosphere would be 3 human hairs. 3 human hairs. That's how fragile it is. That's what we're doing. So eyes on Earth, again, looking down on Earth, taking the data. We can almost now give it to you in real time, close to real time. And then you have the agency. What do you care about? It's hyper-local. What you care about is where you live, where your zip code is. Immersing people in the data. You get to choose which dashboards you might care about, the oceans or the ocean currents. Your city. Zoom right into your city or where your family and your friends are. And then the kind of the map table there on the bottom as Kent's shown, because it's all about people. It's about convening people. It's about people coming together. So again, this is just, the data should be transparent. The data should be in real time. The data should be very useful with our platforms. But it's all about people coming around, making the decisions, especially policymakers, to see how for a flood or a fire, how do we get people out of harm's way? How do we do this together? So we're optimistic. The data can seem overwhelming. It can seem to be a lot. But with the immersion, with giving people agency, we think that literally, take all that data. The world has one of these. So we call that the climate pocket. You care about where you live, what the conditions are, and this is satellite imagery of the future. This is real infrastructure. This is close to Houston, Texas. The next flood is coming. I can't tell you exactly what day or when, but I know it's coming. So giving you a view into the future. Giving you a view into the future is very local and engaging. It has to be trustworthy. It has to be very fast in terms of the machine learning and the AI behind the scenes. And most of all, is to educate people and to give us all agency. So just a few thoughts to open our minds, to think about how we can do this together. And I'll give Bucky the last word. The goal is very clearly to make the world work for 100% of humanity, and we have to get on it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dava, and sorry for the technology problems at the beginning of the presentation. We stuck another minute on the clock. I don't know if you noticed that. And Dava will be joining the public debate this evening as well, at greater length, to talk about off-Earth cities and their consequences for on-Earth cities. Thank you for our speakers for joining me back on stage for a couple of questions. I think we have time, and I'm trying to think which of the two I'd like to ask. I'd like to start with resilience, I think. We've heard about shocks. We heard about the next flood is coming. And I would like to hear from each of our speakers about what is the one thing that they would start with to make our cities more resilient, more able to address those shocks. Is it the built environment? Is it the green environment? Is it technology? Who would like to kick off with resilience?
You're looking at
Well, I'm happy to if you want. I mean, it depends how you define resilience. I mean, resilience classically is bending, not breaking, and being agile. Typically in our world, it's about cities that can respond to climate change without breaking. But I think more importantly, in my mind, it's social resilience and economic resilience. I mean, with our social conditions, the way we do work, the economic future is quite uncertain, as well as all the issues related to climate. So I think we need to build stronger, more vibrant communities with strong social ties, so collectively we can address whatever challenges a community faces. So, for me, that's resilience.
If that's the social aspect, I think resilience really comes down to the physicality of how you respond to change. And I think the optimistic picture, historically, is that human ingenuity has always ensured that as cities have been attacked by man-made or natural disasters, whether it's disease, which has produced typically in London, cholera, created the Noble Embankment, it created modern sanitation, it cleaned the river. The examples abound. I mean, the Great Fire of Chicago created fireproof construction. The Great Earthquake of Lisbon created seismic construction, which was resistant to it. So I think human ingenuity has always prevailed. And if one takes an optimistic view, then the challenges of rising sea levels, of energy, I think if you look on the horizon, there are lots of optimistic signs, as well as the kind of doom watch scenario.
Thank you. Deva?
Well, I'm eternally optimistic, and so it is. Humans are the most resilient species, I think, that you can find. We're very adaptable, but we want to, come together as a community. We can only do this together. So, and there's not one solution. And so we really do have to, I think of the complex systems nature, the complexity of the issues, so there's no silver bullets. But thinking about how to be resilient, and then there's different solutions, there's different actions that we can take individually, and then as our communities. And so if we can, come together, and again, truth in advertising, I think we should explain these complexities in the systems, but then offer people agency, as I said. People are really smart. People are really smart. So give them agency to kind of, again, have their hands on the dials. What if, what if? So it's digital twinning, not just of the cities. To me, it's the digital twin of Earth. Again, that's how we get it right. And let people, be in control. It's always about design and building, in my opinion, for people, around people. It's human-centered design with that agency, that resilience built in. And I remain optimistic that we can get it right.
Edgar, just before you come in with your thoughts, can I introduce the new species on the planet, which is artificial intelligence? Human ingenuity is certainly, as you've said, Norman and Deva, fundamental. It's got us through in the past. Deva, you mentioned you've been in Davos, and that's all they talked about. Edgar, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on AI.
Well, let me start and connect it to the point of resilience. So my starting point would be that we bracket it, because I think that obviously we don't want resilience in terms of the capacity to restore to what exists, because in most of the urban context that I study and am familiar with, that's not a resilient system, and it needs to be transformed in a fundamental and radical way. So that's the one point. The general point that is being made, of course, I agree. And in my view, to be able to figure out resilience capability, we have to start with those people who are really building the cities themselves, but no one is supporting them and no one is seeing them. So there's a question of recognition in the sense that both Dana and Ken spoke about. There is a connect to AI, because I think we all know that the challenges with AI at the moment is in the context of what I glibly refer to as corporate digitization, that at the moment, the potentiality that's there is not going to be used to build the kind of sustainability imaginaries and hopes that we have, because of questions of control and the deployment of that capability for profitability at the expense of the large environmental and social benefits. So I think there's something quite powerful about insisting on open knowledge systems to underpin these AI frameworks to precisely enable these new capabilities and a new kind of urban citizenship that can do the kind of granular decision making that Kent was suggesting. So I think if we can begin to simultaneously be optimistic about the potential of the technology, but also again deal with the regulatory question as the EU is doing, to begin to attend to what I would argue is a really disproportionate power of a few corporate actors in this space.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe that would allow us to talk about barriers. You used the expression, Edgar, the binding constraints. I can see how the work of the Institute must involve imagination, bold visioning, a creative rethinking of possible futures. But that can't be enough, can it? What else? To make a good omelette, you need to break a few eggs. So what are in your own practices, what are those constraints that you would start with trying to overcome in order to let that imagination rip?
speak, I think you need the right environment exactly so that people can be creative and one is curious. So providing that amazing opportunity, again, across the table, everyone to come with their different training, their different disciplines. I have to talk about AI because it is our co-pilot. It's here to stay, and it doesn't work currently. Let's be really clear about that. Our algorithms don't work. Why don't they work? Because they don't work for all. So we have to back it up and ask the question about how does this work for everyone? Once it represents everyone in this room, once they work for everyone and everyone's represented with trusted data, then they work. So that's the task, I think, ahead of us in terms of getting it right, making sure it's equitable. We can do it, but we haven't been doing that. Who owns the data? I would like it to be secure and private and for all of us to own the data. Back to open platforms to get sustainability for this incredibly exciting opportunity we have here with the Institute. I do believe it has to be open to all, open source, because that's when everyone can participate, and that's a real game changer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In terms of constraints, the kind of systems that we've been prototyping, they're just too damn complicated for humans to fully understand. I mean, if you're actually changing, like my example, changing the zoning for every project and dynamically resetting incentives, that requires some beautiful coming together of what humans do best, which is to make value judgments and to be creative, and what machines do best, which is to process vast amounts of information and make these, huge meta connections. So we don't think of artificial intelligence or AGI, artificial general intelligence, which people talk about threatening humanity. It's not really what we're thinking about. We think about AI as augmented intelligence or extended intelligence, where the humans are working creatively with the machines to reach outcomes that neither can do alone.
And Norman, in your work with the UN, what are those barriers? Why can't we make progress faster? What is it that's holding people back? Is it knowledge? Is it the data?
I mean, artificial intelligence is linked into, it's not new, the rate of change, development is new. That has been magnified by the digital revolution. The digital revolution has moved us from centralized systems to autonomous systems. What's the example of that? The example is obviously perhaps the telephone, which once upon a time was mega kilometers of wires across the landscape, telephone exchanges with hundreds of people moving knobs. All of that has evaporated with the satellites in the sky. It's ephemeralized. But meanwhile, the centralized system of energy distribution from coal-fired plants is a relic of the past. And so I hesitate to say this in front of Edgar, because Edgar is the African expert. So at the risk of being the kind of amateur protagonist, Africa does not have the infrastructure that we take for granted in terms of connectivity, in terms of energy. And by 2050, 1 in 4 on the planet will be African. And by Nigeria's own governance research, to cope with industrialization, raising the quality of life to a level that we take in terms of equalizing, to be able to cope with population growth, it will need 15 times the amount of energy that it's consuming at the moment. So, but the technology is there. Africa could leapfrog using autonomous forms of nuclear energy, which avoids plastering the countryside with another form of pollution, which are endless PV cells, which have a 20-year life, and nobody quite knows how, except for landfill, to recycle them. So whether that is an existing technology or whether it's fusion, which hopefully is around the corner, although the joke in scientific communities is it's always 30 years away. But I think it's so I think that the artificial intelligence is incredible, but the reality is we live in the physical world.
On that note, on the physical world, we've got time for short answers to hopefully a short question. Are our cities going to look different as a result of the work of the Institute? For example, I didn't hear a lot about streets and parks and public spaces today. Not from, is there something new, or are we going back in that direction? What is it going to look like?
I think that my utopian vision of the city of the future was along the lines that I described. And it has, and this is something that we share in terms of the background of space syntax.
Question, yeah.
No, I mean, I think the rediscovery of the street, of the grid, of the legible, navigable, walkable, desirable, encouraging environment is all the lessons of history, but using the technology of our time to make it cleaner, quieter, more desirable, safer, secure, and above all else, healthier, mentally and physically. And we have those means, and we can learn from the past, and we can learn from the mistakes of the 60s in terms of chasing models which have not, through experience, proved to be, to advance ourselves as a society.
Yeah, I think we can do two things at once. We can look backwards and really recapture the best of the past, and we can look forward and take advantage of the best possibilities of new systems and technology and materials. And if we can bring those two together, it's not about the look of the city, but I think about the human experience can be profoundly improved.
The feel.
But you are right about the street and about legibility. You can demonstrate that scientifically in terms of the stress.
Yeah.
But that's another subject for another
day. Deva.
Future cities will be in space as well, low Earth orbit. It's only 400 kilometers up. We'll have thousands, if not millions of people. Why? Because it's not so special anymore. We have access, it's being democratized. So I want, again, people to think boldly and run the experiments. Again, learn from history, but think about the future. I do think about the future where people, humanity, are living in our urban environments. We're mostly a water world here, but we have low Earth orbit, and that might be a great place to put manufacturing and all of our data service centers, things like this.
A really good sizzle for your piece this evening. If anyone's coming back later today, there will be a lot more on this. Edgar, you're going to, I think, have the last word in this session.
Do I? Yeah, so I guess for me, my insistence would be that we really challenge ourselves to think in much more pluralistic terms about future possibilities. Because the beauty of this kind of granular, molecular scale of the city, the street, the neighborhood, the precinct, is that we can then really return to the incredible cultural diversity that the world has. But we've got to recognize that the imagination we have now about the compact, walkable city is an imagination that is made possible through an externalization of costs that it took to produce those few examples. And so what if we can really imagine that in a radically egalitarian frame, so that the kind of dramatic cultural diversity that we have in the world, whether it's in Asia, Southeast Asia, or Latin, we can have a mental model which doesn't exist at the moment because we have a very particular set of cultural reference points. So that's for me what the future possibilities are in this kind of rich environment.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry time's against us, but please thank our panel. I think we could have been here all morning. I'm the unpopular one who has to ask people to leave the stage. What we are now going to do is move to a series of short presentations from the three cities that were mentioned earlier, Athens, Bilbao and San Marino. And our first speaker is Georgios from Athens, and the stage, Georgios, is all yours.
I think I need that. Thank you. Buenos días, kalimera to everybody here. I am here to present you some basic policies of the new administration of the city of Athens. The city of Athens got a new administration. Professor Haris Doukas, close friend of mine, he has been elected as a mayor and took office just 3 weeks ago. Actually, it was a surprisingly win back in October because Haris started his campaign just in July, and within 3 months he turned over the odds and he won, and most surprisingly, he won on a green agenda. I mean, what Professor Doukas was saying during the campaign, it was totally different from what was usually be heard during campaigns in cities in Greece. The motto is that he wants to work for a more green, more secure, and more creative city. So I would like to present you 3 of the core policies that form the vision for Athens during the next 5 years. So if I may change the slide. Okay. Now, the first one, and probably the hardest of the commitments made by Professor Doukas, is that we want to plan and we aim to plan 25,000 trees within the next 5 years. Maybe this doesn't sound that impressive, but if we think that during the previous 4 years it has been planted only 4,000 trees in Athens, then we have the context. Athens is a densely populated and densely built city where the tree coverage is just 11% when the EU average is 30%. Of course, we will never be able to reach the EU average because of the lack of the space, but we aim to reach 14 to 15% within the next 5 years. We have already started planting trees, and during the first 3 weeks, we have already planted more than 300 trees. The most difficult here is to find available plots. So we have divided the next 5 years in 2 periods. The first one, we exploit all the available plots right now, so we have quick wins. And also during the first 2.5 years, we make some preparatory work to find available plots for the next 2.5 years. So in total, we want to reach the 25,000 trees goal by the end of the term. Then, sorry. The next policy is about mitigating the climate change impacts. Athens is a Mediterranean city, just like Madrid, and suffers from heat waves during the summer. So the goal here is to combine different technologies and different policies in order to reach the ultimate goal of reducing the earth temperature between 4 and 7 degrees during heat waves in the summer. There are 3 different tools that we can use, that we're going to use. First, we're going to apply cool paving and cold street materials not all over the Athens, that would be very, very expensive, but at least we would like to reach 10% of the most vulnerable neighborhoods. The second one is that we want to reveal the river system that lies underneath of Athens. The last century, Athens has been urbanized in a very great degree, and that has led to the rivers being boxed under the earth. And the third tool, of course, is to increase the green areas, not just the trees, but the green areas as well. All three of these tools, we hope that we will get the goal of reducing the temperature during heat waves. And the last one is about alleviating energy poverty. Athens has some 50,000 energy vulnerable households, and we are going to install roof solar panels and also install solar parks outside of Athens in order to produce renewable electricity, and then provide this renewable electricity at competitive price to vulnerable households, or sell the energy and use the revenues in order to support the vulnerable households. It's difficult, especially within the Athens, but we have a very good team of engineers, and we are gonna do that anyway. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yorgos. And our next speaker is Eda Inunciaga Serna from the great city of Bilbao.
Everyone, or as we say in Basque, egunon. First of all, thank you, Norman and Elena, for having the city of Bilbao and letting us be part of this innovative and disruptive program. I'm here with Susana Ruiz, my colleague from the city of Bilbao, a city that has been known for its industrial character for many decades. I don't know if I can get my presentation. Yeah, thank you. That has been known for its industrial character for many, many decades, but that has been able to overcome the problems that we faced in the 80s mostly. We went through a very heavy global crisis and industrial decline. In the 83, we suffered very, very heavy floods, which destroyed our city, which also created important social problems, drug abuse, alcoholism, and it was all aggravated by a very important problem with terrorism that we had. So at that time, big solutions were needed. The big strategy had to be developed, and the strategy to rebuild the city was created around these four big lines of work: innovation, working on new projects for the city; transport, of course, the metro designed by Mr. Foster here; urban quality, the cleaning of the estuary. Estuary was a very important project. Just so you get an idea, it was 6 times more costly than the Guggenheim Museum itself, and we devoted loads of resources to culture and tourism as well. And all this was done through a public society, Bilbao Ria 2000, that had the energy and the courage to look at the city in a long-term framework. So well, you can see the change of the city, and well, we are very proud about that as well. But currently we are facing new challenges. Currently we are facing new challenges. Most of them have already been posed and explained here today. We are facing demographic challenges. We are facing a very important climate crisis all around the globe. And what we are trying to do is to do what our predecessors did. We are trying to face and think in the long term and think in a very strategic manner. So in order to do that, in the year 2014, we had a very important reflection moment, and we developed this strategic framework for the city. And so what we are trying to do is we are kind of injecting this strategic vision in all the projects that we are developing. And so let's say that we are working in tangible projects and intangible projects, yes? We think that this differentiation is very important. One of the tangible projects, there is a master plan for the city, and that constitutes a very important strategic line for us, is our new general plan. It took us 13 years to work and develop this plan, which has finally been approved in 2022. And we are very proud to say that the process of developing and creating this plan has been a very participatory process. Citizens, both associations and anonymous citizens, have played a very important role in this, both in the diagnosis phase and in the proposal phase. You can see the 4 main strategic lines of the plan, which of course have their own lines of action. But I would like to quickly go through each of the chapters of the plan. It's 9 chapters constitute this plan, because we think that some of the examples that are part of this plan directly tackle those challenges that have been posed here. Oh, sorry. So regarding the physical and natural environment, the situation of our city, we are in a valley, so this is something that is very important for us, how to create corridors from the green areas surrounding us, how to recover and protect our soil. But also, we are working on extending our mobility always in a sustainable manner. Developing new areas of mixed uses for new projects such as the Zorrozaurre Island, Olabeaga, Punta Zorroza. This is something that is also very important for us. The residential areas, we are now in 350,000 inhabitants in the city. We aim at keeping that number stable, and for that, as probably most of you know, the rate of inhabitant per unit is coming down in Europe, so we will have to be building 13,000, either building or rehabilitating new spaces for citizens. We are making loads of efforts on making sure that people have parks and green areas close to their spaces, and the same with district facilities. All of these, of course, incorporated a gender perspective and a climate crisis and a climate change vision. And I would like to finish by saying, as I was mentioning at the beginning, that we give loads of importance to the intangibles as well. For us, values are the common glue. They are something that have to be injected in all the projects that we are developing and thinking for the city. And probably many of you know, United Nations have chosen the city of Bilbao to open and launch the Secretariat for the local 2030 coalition, and this is something that we are also proud of, and we think that the values in this project that is personally boosted and launched by our mayor is something that has to be taken into consideration. And I would like to invite all the students that will be using Bilbao as the project to really get to know this project, and just to finish by saying that we are eager to see the results of your project. Thank you so much. Eskerrik asko. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Ada. Our final speaker in this session is Minister Stefano Canti, Minister for the Territory, Environment, Agriculture and Civil Protection in San Marino. Minister.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to sincerely thank Lord Norman Foster and Lady Foster for the valuable opportunity he has offered the Republic of San Marino to join this academic program and for choosing San Marino as a pilot city. Even before that, I am deeply grateful to Lord Norman Foster for the Declaration of San Marino, which will become part of your country history. In the declaration of which Lord Norman Foster is the first signatory, architect and engineers, as well as the countries adopting it, are invited to apply the social, environmental, inclusiveness and climate change principles contained in it. I would like to recall the Republic of San Marino both in the territory and is important building designed by the great architect Lord Norman Foster, namely the World Trade Center, located near the state border in Dogana, which was inaugurated in 2004. I hope that over collaboration between San Marino and Lord Norman Foster will be started in the next legislature, with a view to implementing new projects, starting with the Museum Center. The Republic of San Marino is strongly committed to urban planning and to the balanced relationship between built and the natural environment. Today, I have the pleasure and the honor to present my country, the Republic of San Marino, to share your experience with all of you, but also to learn from the discussion that will take place today and from the result of the studies of the undertaken during the master's course. San Marino is a small country but, as stated in the Declaration on the Understanding, a universal value adopted by the UNESCO World Heritage Committee in 2008. It is of the oldest republic in the world and, I quote, the only surviving city-state representing an important stage in the development of democratic model in Europe and worldwide. San Marino is an exceptional testimony of the establishment of the representative democratic basis on civic autonomy and self-government, and an exceptional testimony of a living culture and trading that has lasted for 7 countries. The Republic of San Marino is implementing urban generation policies that can make communities safer and more inclusive. Indeed, sustainability, inclusion, and biodiversity protection policies are the basis of the main tool for the planning and management of San Marino territory. Today's building heritage of the Republic of San Marino and this urban organization are the result of historical events, economic relations, and structural and urban planning choices made during the 20th centuries. The current government of the Republic of San Marino deems it important these territorial policies are integrated with the environment. Moreover, it considers the territory not only as a physical and natural environmental, but as a place where people, families, and all human activities can find the optional living, health, and self-expression conditions, and a resource that, to its natural beauty, is activity to visitors and businesses. In 2000, at the beginning of the current legislature, the Working Group for Sustainable Development has set with the aim of drafting up a plan of intervention of achieve the Sustainable Development Goal of the United Nations 2030 Agenda. The Working Group for Sustainable Development immediately started working with the aim of drafting the country's development project. Moreover, it is decided to instruction all department director to draw up a report and the status of implementation of each sustainable development goal, assigned to on the basis of their respective responsibilities. The first voluntary national report of the 2030 Agenda goals was drafted, and we continued working to identify strategies and the project to meet the goals proposed in the UN 2030 Agenda. As today, for the update in the National Strategic Plan is underway, and they can anticipate what small goals and being achieved and what they working in others. In conclusion, I wish all professors and the students a fruitful academic year and on again in the duty and thank Lord Norman Foster for choosing the Republic of San Marino a pilot city and his collaboration for making his master course possible. I wish you a fruitful work and achieve many results. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Yorgos and Eder, for your only 2 brief comments. I wish we had longer. I don't know about you, time for a coffee. We're going to have a break now, and we will be looking forward to welcoming you back here in the auditorium in 15 minutes' time. You'll be directed back here. Coffee is where you came in at the entrance. See you shortly. Thank you.
Since its launch in 2017, the Norman Foster Foundation has promoted interdisciplinary working and research to enable new generations to anticipate the future. Building on that tradition, we've now created a new initiative of the Foundation, the Norman Foster Institute. It's addressed in a time of climate change to all of those who either through education or practice wish to improve the quality of urban life in cities worldwide. The course will combine practical, hands-on experience directly in cities, alongside academic inputs from the network of foundation experts, politicians, consultants, professors, developers. They'll learn how to interpret data using the most up-to-date digital tools in the quest to improve a sustainable quality of urban life.
For those of you who missed the first session today, that was your catch-up. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your coffee. I'm Tim Stonor, the chair, and I'm going to take us through to the conclusion of the event. We are going to have a similar sort of format as we had earlier. We've got 3 more speakers who are going to give a piece and then join me on stage for a discussion. And then we've got a couple more after that to continue to add dimensions to this discussion of sustainability. Our first speaker, Alejandro Aravena, is the Executive Director of Elemental in Santiago, Chile, and a member of the Academic Council of the Norman Foster Institute.
So to the 26 students, I thought of sharing some of that gap in between academia and practice. And so I guess that what's the role of housing in sustainable cities? Well, there are good news and bad news. And let me start with sharing the case of, before that, because maybe on housing, we had a very different understanding. If you Google housing in English, this is at least what my algorithm shows. If you Google it in Spanish, this is what comes out. So for us, housing is this. And that may be a completely different background from what, for these cities that are going to be the case for the Institute are. So I want to start by sharing the case of Chile, not because I want you to become experts in Chile, but because it has one foot on Edgar's world and another foot on Kent and David's world. So in the informal and the formal, and we're always on the verge of falling on one side or the other. So one question could be, what do we do to make it fall on the right side? Or let's say on the good news. So a little bit of history to understand. So for decades in Chile, with a subsidy of $10,000, we're bringing down the housing deficit, both for the slums, which is very minor in Chile, yet is significant, and for the housing deficit in general. Sorry. So actually, in 23, we did our first elemental project that, in order to address a scarcity of resources, we came with a strategy of incrementality. So you allow over time to the system to achieve the standard that on day one with public funds you cannot afford. So that until 2010, when an 8.8 Richter scale earthquake and tsunami hit the country. This is not the only reason, but it's definitely a tipping point in what was happening in housing in Chile, where we added 300,000 units back to the deficit, and somewhere today where we were in the 70s. So yeah, that housing deficit was not only at the housing scale, but at the entire city scale. So we worked in the reconstruction in a specific city in the south of Chile, in Constitución, with a very intensive participatory design process, and already there we witnessed, and actually in the Venice Biennale in 2012, we called the projects that we presented there the magnet and the bomb. This double condition of cities that attract people, ideas, capital, resources, but at the same time they accumulate social, political pressure as a ticking time bomb. We actually, following the participatory process we did in Constitución, we were working in mining cities in the north, copper towns, where you were already witnessing that accumulation of pressure. That ultimately exploded on October 19 and 2019, where because of an increase of 1 cent in the public transportation system, a huge blast, and the subway were burned. I mean, it was a national pride, that kind of thing. Most of the society in Chile was wondering, but what happened? Why was this, where was this pressure accumulating? Because in our peripheries, that pressure was accumulating invisibly. That led us to what we are still today, rewriting the Constitution, you know, to set up a new set of rules for how to live together again. So the interesting thing is that normally, and we in our work concentrate on, say, on the lower part, trying to bring down the deficit. But one of the explanations, not the only one, for that social blast was actually in the upper part of the curve, where even though we solved the housing issue, so we were successful in doing housing, we were unsuccessful in producing cities. So this non-city that was created in our peripheries, where there were no opportunities, where, you know, people came to cities and found themselves segregated, isolated in those peripheries, is part of what began to happen and accumulating from the 70s on. So I had a presentation in the Congress a couple of months ago, and because I was trying to explain to politicians, policymakers, what we did wrong, or we are living now through a housing deficit emergency, and so make sure that we did not make the same mistake once again. And when I was trying to explain this, what is it to be in those peripheries? And for lack of a better word, in that presentation, I was referring to Mad Max. A couple of weeks later, I found a film by Alejandro González Iñárritu, Bardo, that in minute 59, in 3 minutes, has the best explanation I've ever found, and this is something I would like to share with you now to understand where we are at this moment. A little bit of context of the film. This is an imaginary film, a documentary filmmaker that is receiving an award and is showing this fictional interview within the film. So the next 3 minutes is this interview to this narco in jail, which is what is happening in our peripheries. A parallel state has taken over. So So these are the 3 minutes that start with this. This is a filmmaker interviewing the guy and asking, are you afraid of death? And this goes to the question of value of life. What does life mean in peripheries? Sorry. So make sure, can you make it run? Yeah.
La muerte para ustedes es un drama cristiano. En una cama, por un ataque al corazón. Para nosotros es la comida diaria, tirados en la fosa común. Aquí en la cárcel, nadie puede entrar y matarte. Pero yo puedo mandarles matar a ustedes allá afuera. Yo era pobre, invisible. Ustedes me negaron atención durante décadas. Y ahora los tengo agarrados de los huevos. Nosotros somos hombres bomba. En las Villa Miseria hay millones de hombres bomba. Estamos en el centro mismo de lo insoluble. Ya somos una nueva especie. Ya somos otros bichos diferentes a ustedes.
¿Qué debimos haber hecho?
Ustedes los intelectuales se la pasan hablando de lucha de clases, de marginalidad, y entonces llegamos nosotros. Ya no hay más proletarios, o infelices, o explotados. Hay una tercera cosa creciendo ahí afuera, cultivándose en el barro, educándose en el más absoluto analfabetismo, escondido en los rincones de la ciudad. Está usted delante de una especie de posmiseria.
¿Pero qué es lo que cambió en las periferias?
Lana. Ahora tenemos millones. Y ustedes son el Estado quebrado, gobernado por incompetentes.
¡A huevo!
¿Me entiendes? Nosotros tenemos métodos ágiles de gestión. Y ustedes son lentos, burocráticos. Nosotros no tememos a la muerte. Ustedes mueren de miedo. Nosotros estamos bien armados. Ustedes tienen calibre 38. Nosotros estamos en el ataque, ustedes a la defensa. Ustedes tienen la manía del humanismo. Nosotros somos crueles, sin piedad. Ustedes nos han transformado en superstars del crimen. Nosotros los tenemos de payasos. Nosotros somos ayudados por la población de las ciudades miseria, por miedo o por amor. Ustedes son odiados. Ustedes son regionales, provincianos, nacionalistas, corruptos.
Tenemos 50 millones de gringos adictos.
Nuestras armas vienen de fuera, del gabacho. Somos globales. Nosotros no nos olvidamos de ustedes. Son nuestros clientes. Ustedes no se olvidan en cuanto pasa el susto de la violencia que provocamos.
So there, the rule of law has been replaced by the law of the jungle. There's a parallel state with a parallel economy, a parallel welfare, that is at the same time more brutal and more sophisticated. I mean, things like honor or loyalty matter, and at the same time, there's too many people with walking bones that have nothing to lose with no purpose. What the narco did is to identify very carefully and give a purpose to people that have not that purpose. Is that responsibility of cities? Not, but we created that environment, and we should make sure that it won't happen again. So the thing is that, what to do? Well, one possibility is an understanding that, oh, sorry, my time's up. So in short, this is not a crime against, war against crime. This is a cultural battle. This is a different set of values. And we need to create a parallel narrative, different narrative that may go from belongings as a way to prove value to belonging, a verb. We architects have very little to do here. Maybe we need here an army of filmmakers to create that parallel narrative, or musicians, or sportsmen that are a role model for that. We may then come backward with the right background. Just to show quickly, a project in Buenos Aires for the Inter-American Development Bank, where in the biggest slum in Buenos Aires, we were using the opportunity of that institution to create a bridge between the informal and the formal. Or the good news, there's a paradigm shift possibility where the creation of this new city might trigger development instead of being the consequence of it. And along those lines, we've been working in this incremental housing where value gain has been a direct transfer of capacity to families. And we're expanding the toolbox both to the other end of the spectrum of the slum in one direction, or to the families that are too poor for the banks, but too rich for the state, which is another neglected part of the society. So let's talk about these other things during the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. That was provocative and powerful and gives us a lot to talk about within the Institute. Our next speaker is Vishan Chakrabarti, founder, creative, and creator of the practice Architecture and Urbanism in New York and a member of the Academic Council of the Norman Foster Institute. Vishan.
Good morning, thank you. That was the perfect setup, believe it or not. Norman and Elena, congratulations. This is a historic day, and I also want to congratulate the scholars. And I have to confess that I'm a little jealous because the scholars recognize, obviously, that how we live influences all the pivotal issues of our day. And, you know, if I could have the presentation, please. Yeah. So, there's a desire to be both excellent and relevant among the scholars. And this reminds me of 30 years ago when I entered architecture school in Berkeley, College of Environmental Design, because 30 years ago, the students knew. But when we came out of school, this is what we were being told what excellence was. Create a personal style, repeat it across the globe, make a name for yourself, act as an artist in the world. And this still goes on today, that we celebrate this. And I just want to say, this is work of colleagues and friends, and I very much respect it. It is extremely hard to do. What I'm complaining about is the culture that says this is the limitation of the role of the architect, that this is what we are here for. And so in my own work, we try to advance place and pluralism and planet, but I just want to say that I think my work is completely irrelevant to the subject at hand. The subject at hand is, I think, the broader history of architects dealing with the largest social issues of our day. Sometimes not very well, but nonetheless taking on the bigger questions beyond their own architecture. And especially after World War II, the merger with urbanists, urban designers, housers, Catherine Bauer, who practically invented public housing in the United States, and architects like Max Bond, who worked in Harlem trying to combine and synthesize these issues. And so when I think about this, I think about the tradition of Houbraken, which has influenced so many of us and is coming back, and I think is integral to some of the work that Alejandro has done and known so well for. Or the work of Doxiades. I mean, these are all old names, but they are actually extraordinarily important names, I think, for the scholars to look back at a moment when people were thinking about some of the issues that we are thinking about now. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that Norman has been at the forefront of this notion of pushing beyond being the great architect of great buildings. And the foundation and the institute, it seems to me, are representations of this, of a master plan for a city still under bombardment, of not being afraid of controversy and saying maybe in the 1970s and the 1980s we got it wrong about nuclear power and we need to rethink our stance. And as an architect, bringing that conversation to scientists and policymakers. So there's a whole other side of our work in our practice that attempts in small ways to stand on these very big shoulders. After the presidential election of 2016 in the United States, we wrote a letter with the American Civil Liberties Union and other civic organizations trying to identify public space for public expression throughout New York City, including some of the poorest areas of New York. And then that same year, an extraordinary collaboration started with the New York Times opinion section. First a piece advocating for change to our central train station. This is the busiest transportation hub in the Western Hemisphere, and it is a disaster in terms of safety, in terms of equity, in terms of dignity. A few years later, a vision of what could Manhattan look like if you rid it of private cars. And again, not getting into the debate about whether it's an electric car or a shared car, but as an architect looking at the physical space that a car takes up in a city. And so most recently, we had this extraordinary opportunity to team with the Times. The Times asked us about the housing crisis in New York. And this is a housing crisis that we could talk about in many cities around the world, frankly. And it's interesting, the cities that Norman listed from Monocle and The Economist, all of those cities that people love to live, yes, those are places where people love to live, and they're places where people don't want any more people to live. So what we are finding in the most progressive parts of our big cities around the world is that they don't want any growth. New York is a strange exception to this, because New York is a city that is a city in the global north but has an extraordinary connection to the global south. We have processed over 100,000 migrants from the southern border as an act of politics, but also as an act of love. But we have over 100,000 people living on the streets of New York City, including many children. And the whole reason for this is because we have an incredibly small rate of production of housing. And so the Times asked us to do an analysis as well as a written piece that backs this. So what I'm now showing you is what you would see if you went online and went on your phone or you went on your iPad and looked at this. It used to be that you paid about 20% of your income as an average New Yorker for rent. Now you pay about 50%, depending on what you do. So we identified sites near public transit and outside of the flood zones to look at where we could find sites for housing. We found 10,000 sites, 1,700 acres, and then we looked at different typologies of sites to calculate how much housing could be built that was not higher than the structures around it. So in other words, we were trying to keep within the neighborhood character of each specific. So you see this is close to the apartment building next to it, about 60 units of housing. This in a single family neighborhood, which we do have in New York, where we're proposing a small scale apartment house that could house more people obviously than a single family house. Or places that are only 1 or 2 stops from Manhattan that could actually afford much more density. And so what was extraordinary about this is we said if we keep within the character, which is often the big debate in our big popular cities, and this is also, by the way, looking at office to residential conversion, which we did not find a lot of housing in. But when we added all of that up, we found enough housing for 520,000 homes, 1.3 million New Yorkers could be housed in all of that housing without changing the central character of New York City. And this for us was an extraordinary research exercise. It also kind of broke the internet in terms of what we then heard as the feedback mechanism for basically saying to people that you can have growth in all of these cities, even in a city like Madrid, even in beautiful historic cities. And that has an absolute connection to the conditions Alejandra was just talking about. Because as you think about borders and how our borders will get more stressed with climate change, we have to think about how to accommodate more people in the cities where people want to live, that have transportation, have infrastructure, and so forth. So I just want to close with this last slide, if I can get it up. My wife and I were standing here just 2 days ago. This is Villa Tungenhat in Brno, in Prague. And I show you this image because it is a canonical masterwork by Mies van der Rohe. Many of you know it. And of course, as architects, we should appreciate the beauty, the detail, the technological innovation that went into this. But Mies also had a favorite quote of mine. He said, "Architecture is the will of the epoch translated into space." And I think what he meant by that is that it is both a mirror and a window into the challenges we face as society. It is more than just the beauty of the house and asks us to look not just at the house, but the city beyond.
in a house that was built for a Jewish industrial family who could only live there for 8 years, then got taken over by the Nazis and then the Communist Party, and was only ultimately restored by the Tugendhat daughter, who returned many, many years later. And so we can never look at architecture in a vacuum. So I thank Norman and Elena for broadening the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vishan. That was excellent. The final panelist in this session is Beatriz Corredor. She's the chairwoman here in Madrid at Redea and former Minister of Housing for this great country, Spain. Beatriz.
Hello, good morning, and thank you so much, Norman Foster. Thank you, gracias, Elena, for getting to Madrid to this wonderful and amazing initiative. And I'm very honored to be here, and I want to say hello to the scholars. Where are you, the scholars? The scholars? You are so lucky. so lucky, because you are going to have this amazing experience here in my hometown. And it's my honor to share the panel with these wonderful architects. When I was Minister of Housing, the architecture college was under my protection. So I met wonderful architects in Spain and outside Spain. And you know, Norman, that Spanish architects are the best in the world. That's right. So I used to say that when I am a teacher in a Master of Real Estate Development, and I gave to my students the subject called Social and Affordable Housing. And your elemental project was one I shared with my students to say that social housing is the future of the cities. And I think that your experience is so fruitful for the students. And what about the futures in the city? 1,000 years ago, nobody thinks about the future. Future for human being and for humanity was just thinking about eternity, because nobody thinks that the future is going to be different from theirs. But now future is in our minds. We can think how future is going to be 20, 30, 100 years beyond us. And this is just from 200 years ago, more or less, because it was triggered by pioneers and visionaries as writers as Verne or Wells or Asimov. So now we do think about the future, and we should think about the future. That's why anticipating that is the purpose of this wonderful institute of Norman Foster is so important, because if we anticipate the future, we can take better decisions in order to shape this future in a way that will be acceptable for us human beings. And that's why the World Economic Forum has just appointed in its last report, saying that in 2023, the short-term concerns of people were environmental, to short-term and to long-term, 2 and 10 years ahead. But in 2024, this has shifted, and now short-term concern is about social concerns, about migrations, and long-term concerns are environmental. So we have only one certainty, that is, change is our only certainty. And uncertainty and inequality are, I think, the main features we are going to face. And what are the trends that are shaping our future? From a social and geopolitical point of view, population, we are 8 million or billion people. India has surpassed China as the most populous country of the planet. In population density, we have, for example, South Asia with 400 people per square kilometers, but, for example, in Europe, we have 100 people, for example, and in Africa, we have 48 people per square kilometer. What about life expectancy? Women, we are one who lives more, 75 years, men, only 70 years. And what about net migrations? The main receivers are Europe and United States, and people are coming from Latin America and Africa. And what about literacy? Differences persist by geographical areas. And what about economics? GDP, increasing worldwide. United States is 22% of all growth of GDP. After it, Europe, it's Asia and the Pacific, with, in the global, 83% of the worldwide GDP. And per capita GDP, China does not surpass still the EU. And population with access to electricity, 90% in the world's population, but only 48% in Africa. The Human Development Index in 2021 was just a very, very, very few increase from many decades ago. It's from 0.6 to 0.7. And my iPad has decided to go ahead because I think I'm in a hurry. And the Gini Index, the biggest inequalities are in Latin American and Caribbean countries. And technology, internet access. The global use of internet reaches 60% of the population, but 90% in the United States, 80% in Europe, and only 30% or 40% in Africa. And what about the GDP dedicated to research and development? United States, 3.6 of its GDP. Asia and South Pacific, 2.6 of the GDP. Europe, only 2.3 of its GDP. Patent application, China, in recent years, 1,300,000 patents per year, and of course surpassing USA with 11% of all the patents worldwide. EU, come on, European, only 4% of all the patents. And environment, what about CO2 emissions? Global emissions of greenhouse gas has doubled since 2000. And of course, where the temperature differences from 1951 to 1980 average has risen more, 1 degree in the south, global south, 2 degrees in the global north. So we have a problem in the global north. We should help the global south to jump up for 150 years, because for a century and a half, we've been developing ourselves with fossil fuels. And now we can say to the South Global, no, please, don't use more. Come to the renewable energy, but 150 years after. And what is the future going to say with these kind of different trends? We can imagine a future balance where balanced people, we can imagine a harmonious development for society, but we can imagine a different future with technology controlling society and minds, or a future with inequalities persisting, or another in which social disenchantment prevails. And confronting ourselves with this vision can make easier for us to imagine and to shape this future. And maybe we can decide that our future is going to be balanced. We can decide that our future is going to be for frustrated people, or angry people, or alienated people. And what these have to be or to do with cities, where cities are going to be the home for 2/3 of the population in 2050. 5 billion people are going to be in cities, so energy and digitalization are the key drivers for cities. So energy is about how to integrate renewable energy to the grid and to the cities. And it's not only about mobility, it's not only about electric cars, it's about domotic, it's about how to implement solar panels, how to this renewable energy is going to be available for everyone, not for that has money in their pockets. And of course, we cannot have a smart city from a sustainable point of view if we don't have a digital transformation, because this digital should be available for everyone and should be affordable as well. And please, in a democratic way. We, the European Commission, are the first around the world that has enhanced a new law for artificial intelligence. And I think we should be very aware of what artificial intelligence can do in our democracies. and private data, privacy, intimacy, and personal decisions should be so forced by artificial intelligence that I think that governments should be very aware of that. And I want to invite you to share this evening a panel with Deva about cities beyond Earth, because of course what's happening in the space is going to be important for us too. And I'm saying this because I'm chairwoman of a company that has inside Ispasat, that is the Spanish company for satellites. So I think that it's very interesting for us to know what's happening beyond the atmosphere. So, just to sum up, I think it's most urgent than ever to think about future. And you see that there is an important English writer that saw it before us. It's William Shakespeare, who says in his play Coriolanus, "What's the city but the people? Yes, people are the city." So these are our point, our purpose. Thank you very much.
We're going to stay on stage. Thank you, Beatrice.
I was escaping.
No, you're not going to escape. Thank you, Alejandro, Vishan, for joining me on stage. Thank you for your presentations. Beatrice, you mentioned the word urgent towards the end of your remarks there, and that's actually where I wanted to begin, about urgency. Alejandro, you put up a figure that said in Chile 100,000 housing units are needed per year. I was looking at a figure recently that shows globally we need to build 100,000 housing units a day to cope with this growth that we've just heard. How can we do that in a way that is not going to make these problems of anger and disconnection even worse? What's the method that we need to follow? What can the scholars do differently?
Should I start?
Anyone?
Add 1P to the PPP alliance, private-public people's partnership. Slums, it's a huge amount of capacity that instead of being repressed or replaced has to be channeled as part of the built environment. Don't having enough resources in Chile, we understood that capacity of spontaneous constructions, if well channeled, and that's the role of the professional to coordinate those forces, can bring, from the social housing standard, 40 square meters, that evidence shows is not enough. It's okay in around 80. Those next 40 come from people themselves. So I would say the moment we're able to understand this big force of the slums as part of the solution instead of being part of the problem, we may have a chance.
And how's that? Can you continue? How do we recognize that? What is needed to put these people front and center in a way that they haven't been to date?
Well, of course, the coordination is the scarcest resource in cities. It's not money. And then the role of design, which whenever there's a complex question, synthesis is desired. And if there's any power in design, that's the power of synthesis. So that's the role of design. Participatory processes we have found to be extremely important, but participatory processes are not this kind of romantic thing that you go and ask people, how would you like? I mean, that's not the thing. It's first and foremost to identify what is the question that needs to be answered. And people will tell you that sometimes you are trying to answer, well, the wrong question. It's very important as part of the participatory process, and it leads to coordination, identify priorities. And if there's anybody that knows how to, understand what's more relevant, is people that have to squeeze, milk out of the stones. So there's wisdom there, and maybe that's the third part of the thing. If you put people on the table, we may contribute with some type of knowledge, they contribute with a different type of knowledge, and both knowledges is what is key in the end. Human ingenuity, Norman was talking about, so that knowledge is crucial, and will come from those communities organized and not seen as a kind of hippie thing, but in a very pragmatical, down-to-earth condition.
Beatrice, could I ask, what is the role of, you're a former minister, what is the role of the state in this? What is the role of the private sector where you now are in this? To be part of this conversation, do you need to change your practice corporately? And with your former hat on, is there a state governance transformation?
I think here is the Secretary General of Housing, actually, and he is the one who answered this question. But of course, in my experience, what Alejandro was saying is the key issue. You should make people participate in the decision-making process. And I think the designing of cities, designing of cities is very important for integrate how people live in there. And I'm aware of public spaces. I think the public spaces, you have talked about that. Public spaces, not only outside, in the outdoor, but indoor. Public spaces are the places where people should share their experience and their lives. And public authorities should be aware of that. It's not only given houses, new housing processes by integrated housing in the city. So it's about building cities, as he has said. It's very difficult because the budget for social housing is not always as huge as should be, and there are many different levels of governance implicated in this process. Because, for example, in Spain we have the national government, and then we have the regional government, and then we have the municipality government with different budgets, with different purpose, and it's very difficult to just align all of the decisions. But unfortunately, the main reason to align them is money. So you have enough budget to transfer to the region. Maybe they are able to make what you want to. And of course, we have not talked about it, but in cities, refurbishment is, I think, refurbishment and retrofitting and to renewal. Yeah. The neighborhoods are very important. And this is my former responsibility now. I'm responsible for integrating renewable energy in the neighborhoods, and they are experts on that. And the digitalization of the cities without taking back the privacy and the personal freedom to the authorities, that I'm very aware of that. So I think that I agree with P. That's why I think that social impact should be in the states, on the states, for every player in this cities.
Thank you. Thank you. Vishaan, I was taken by your example of data analysis in New York and the intensification of existing places. Is it so obvious as to say we should not be growing our cities anymore? We should be looking to infill and intensify. And surely that flies in the face of the instincts of planners worldwide, which is to identify the next piece of land to build onto.
Which is exactly, look, that's the 20th century model. I mean, you look at the slides that Alejandro showed when he Googled housing, and the model of saying we're going to provide housing for people by building these monocultures out somewhere, whether that's suburban sprawl in wealthy countries or low-income housing that has no other services, no infrastructure, right, out in the middle of nowhere, right, because there is a resistance to dealing with change in the center of the city. You know, Kent started with this notion that in cities we can maybe do more about climate than national governments. I believe in that. But at the same time, city dwellers have to have a certain pact about this notion that the city evolves, that the city is not a museum, right? And that, yes, we have to be sensitive. Because one of the things I want to be careful of it, both in this panel and the last one, is, you know, we talk about global north issues in a way that I think sounds different than global south issues. But I really believe this is going to become more and more interconnected over time. We're experiencing this firsthand. And with climate refugees, we are going to experience this firsthand. And so the challenge will become a governance and political issue in terms of whether the democratic bases of cities are going to allow that evolution to take place or not.
So surely the challenge is how to persuade the existing city dwellers that it's of benefit for there to be more city dwellers where they are.
We got very good feedback on this notion of things being built within character. People do have aesthetic sensitivity about their neighborhoods. They also have a sensitivity about the fact that cities have been changing in a way that makes them all anonymous.
Yeah.
And there's concern about that that's legitimate.
Yeah.
What's interesting is the developers in New York hated the article. You would have thought they would have liked it, but they don't really want to build in those scales.
Because it's harder. It's much harder.
It's harder. There's a whole bunch of reasons we don't have the time to get into, but like this is now about maybe communities building these things, religious organizations, and getting local politicians to have the courage to back that evolution.
I mean, it seems to me we need to sell the city better than we have been. And it would be wrong, but easy, to take away from today's presentations the fact that there are big threats to our cities, that cities have this almost mechanical responsibility to keep the floodwaters back and handle the risks of fire and plague and so on. But actually, isn't there an upside to the city that needs to be sold? And if I could, I want to reference Sir Stuart Lipton, who we're lucky to have with us today. Stuart, eminent property developer based in London, UK, who came up to me in the interval and he said, ask them about fun, and ask them about the arts, and ask them about the civic well-being. How do we sell the city? Alejandro, what are your thoughts on this?
So I will comment on that, but I wanted to comment first on what you just said on your previous question, talking about ministers. So Minister of Housing, who's the minister that is not here? It's the Minister of Finance. So normally, the paradigm is that the Minister of Finance does his work, so a wealthy country, and then you have to ask an appointment for funding for your good city. But in UN Habitat 3, so what to do with the emergency of the thing, in Quito in 2016, there was another take on that relationship to reverse the paradigm shift, where cities, instead of being the consequence of being wealthy, could be the cause and could trigger development. That reverse in the paradigm would make it the other way around. You will be doing your city, and the Minister of Finance will ask an appointment to you if you do your work properly. And for that to happen, in a nutshell, UN Habitat 3 was right rule of law, right financing that includes people, resources, and the right design. And there was a double click that you can see on the Quito papers, on the London School of Economics, on what does it mean good design. Talking about fun, finally. This requires a definition of what is fun. What we witness as fun in our peripheries is this is connected to values. So I'm going to make it as short as possible. I was asked by New York Times to write an article on a tipping point, and the title was going to be From Belongings to Belonging.
Yeah.
It didn't get through in the end because I was blaming on the Kardashians of the world for the role model of that you're valuable if you have stuff. So to have fun in our cities is following that role model. A guy that has a life expectancy of 24 years old goes and steals a car, not to sell it and buy food for the family, but to post it on Instagram, so I also have fun.
Yeah.
And I have things, so I'm valuable. So that change of narrative, of a different epic, where fun and desire and emotions play a huge role, that is going to be the ultimate driver. Yes, I agree. But we have to create this parallel narrative so that fun is civilized and not brutal as it is today.
Thank you.
I just want to make a very quick point about this idea about fun and culture in cities. We have to remember that culture comes from people. Hip-hop came from the streets. Culture is not only some commodified thing that's experienced up here. So if you don't have housing that's affordable for the people who create the culture, you have just a Disneyfied plastic culture.
Thank you. Thank you. Beatrice, you're going to get the last word, because I know you also have to leave us shortly.
Yes, just to sell my a town or a city that will be wonderful to live in, a city where children, women, and grandparents can live freedom and in security. unwalkable. For children, women, and grandparents, and everybody's going to live very well there. All right?
Stuart, I hope you're happy. We're getting there. Fun is life, fun is humanity are the words. What a wonderful note, and to the scholars, have fun. And thank you to my panelists. Thank you very much. We're nearly there, but we're not quite there yet. We have two further contributions to the day, and I'm going to pass immediately to Glyn Richards, who is Group Director of Sustainability at Bupa, one of the supporters of the Institute, who will know much about the subject. Glyn.
Thank you. Oh, going the wrong way. It's a good start. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is, as you've heard, Glyn Richards. I am the Group Director of Sustainability at Bupa. I wanted to start by quoting something that Lord Foster said, actually, at the recent climate conference, COP28. He said, "The future of our societies is the future of our cities." And he also said that cities are arguably our greatest invention. Now, we know that cities are complex systems, so the work that the Norman Foster Institute is kicking off today with the Sustainable Cities Programme is, in my view, essential, and frankly, something that we are very happy to support at Bupa. Now, if you're not familiar with Bupa, we're an international healthcare company, and we've been looking after people's health for around 75 years. If you're based here in Spain, you'll probably better know us through our Spanish branding, Sanitas. You may be asking yourself what a company like our own, one that is focused on healthcare, has to do with cities. In a word, everything. Our health happens in our cities. Human health and the health of the planet are intrinsically interlinked. We cannot continue to look after our people's health unless we also create healthy environments in which they thrive. We also know that cities are on the front line of climate change, being responsible for, as you've heard already, 2/3 of global energy demand and 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and also experiencing the growing health impacts of climate change. And we see these health impacts today from increasing heat-related mortality, more frequent life-threatening extreme weather events, and the increasing spread of climate-sensitive infectious diseases such as dengue fever. Together, climate change and cities, our cities, impact every aspect of our health, from the air that we breathe, the buildings in which we live, the access to green spaces, and the way that we travel. And as you see here, research from C40 Cities shows that in a scenario where no further climate action is taken, 1.6 billion city residents will suffer extreme heat, 800 million will suffer flooding, and 650 million will suffer increases in their freshwater insecurity. At Davos just last week, the World Economic Forum published data that highlighted by 2050, climate change may cause 14.5 million extra deaths and $12.5 trillion worth of economic losses. These statistics underscore the risks of us not tackling the health impacts of climate change. With over half the world's population already living in our urban centres, and that forecasted to grow to 70% by 2050, cities across the globe must take centre stage in tackling the health impacts of climate change. Now, how do we do that? We need to reimagine the way that we design cities. We need to create a new model for cities that achieves ambitious climate targets whilst also encouraging or improving social and economic performance and addressing public health concerns. This is the biggest challenge and the greatest opportunity for our urban centres today. It's a huge task and not something that can be delivered in isolation. So collaboration is going to be key. But that's why it's so exciting to hear the huge diversity of perspectives that we've heard from city representatives, from the academics, the architects, over the course of just this morning. We have so many different stakeholders coming together here to discuss the challenges from their differing standpoints. And it is notable, I think, that health is a unifying theme across these interventions, and it is something that I believe can bring all city actors together to accelerate action. Putting health at the centre of how our cities are designed can not only contribute to significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and improved resilience to climate change, but also provide significant tangible benefits to the lives of our urban populations. And that is why putting health at the centre of how cities are designed is a core component of our collaboration with between Bupa and the Norman Foster Foundation. And that culminated in a report, the Healthy and Resilient Cities report, co-written with the C40 cities in the Lancet Countdown and launched at the UN conference, COP28. Now, COP28 also saw the first Health Day, the first ever Health Ministerial Declaration, and most notably, the first ever Local Climate Action Summit, which highlighted the critical role that local leadership can play in addressing climate change. It is up to all of us to grasp this unique opportunity, to reimagine how we can work together alongside our local communities, as we've heard, to make the world's cities more healthy and more resilient places to live. And to support this work further, we'll be working with the Norman Foster Institute on Sustainable Cities as an official health partner and delivering some special health workshops during the course of this year. So very much look forward to that. Our partnership obviously builds on strong relationships between the Norman Foster Foundation and Sanitas here in Spain. And I'd like to thank the Norman Foster Institute and the Norman Foster Foundation for organising this incredible event. Forums like this are critical because they bring together different voices in the spirit of collaboration to improve the lives of people living in our communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glyn. Our final speaker today is Brett Stevens, journalist, editor, and columnist at the New York Times. Brett, we're very happy to have you here, and the stage is all yours. Thank you.
Well, I am neither an architect nor an urban planner. I'm not a real estate developer, and I'm not thinking of colonizing space. But I do want an invitation back to Madrid. So I have titled my remarks, Why Norman's Building is Better Than Renzo's Building. So ever since there have been great newspapers, which is from at least the last quarter of the 19th century, there have been great newspaper buildings, each of them reflecting a particular concept or ideal of the role that journalism is supposed to play in a modern society. Let me show you the first one. Nope, wrong way. So Joseph Pulitzer built and all but designed the great New York World building. It's the one that you see on your left in 1890 on what was then called Manhattan's Newspaper Row in Lower Manhattan as the world's then tallest office building, 94 meters high, serviced by elevators, capped with a cupola and an observation deck for tourists who were willing to pay a nickel. Pulitzer's building was designed to convey the moral authority of a church, the technical wizardry of an industrial society, and the secular confidence of 19th century capitalism. It towered above neighboring City Hall, run by the notoriously corrupt Tammany Hall political machine, as a kind of populist watchdog. Next slide. Robert McCormick, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, completed his famous Tribune Tower in 1925 at the southern foot of the city's Magnificent Mile. as a kind of feudal palace mixing flying buttresses, which you can see up on top, soaring heights, and the lavish ornamentation of a Gothic cathedral with the efficiencies of a modern office tower. It was an effort to make a young city look old, a brash newspaper seem venerable, and a self-important proprietor feel important. Much like Rupert Murdoch today, McCormick ran his newspaper to advance a personal political agenda. He was sometimes described as the greatest mind of the 14th century, but only behind his back. A few years later, in New York, we got the Art Deco headquarters of the Daily News, a building and a newspaper that reflected values with both a lowercase and a capital case D of its proprietor. Unlike the Chrysler building just across 42nd Street, it was not meant to be a foreground building, making itself loved or hated, but rather a background building, making itself felt. Having a printing plant on its lower 9 floors and an office tower on its upper 27 reflected the spirit of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the union of technocratic managerialism and working class values in the service of the everyman reader. In this century, I can think of only 2 architecturally innovative and distinguished news media buildings. Once again, both in New York, and as it happens, both on 8th Avenue. The first, is Norman's Hearst Tower at 57th Street, a 46-story tower of steel and sky blue glass, the diagrid pattern resting within and atop the elegant original 6-story neoclassical base built in 1928. The second, is Renzo Piano's New York Times building on 41st Street, designed, like so many of his buildings, to appear mechanical and metallic on the outside, but airy, light, and oasis-like on the inside. Let's see if I can show you the inside. Something's not happening. There we go. On the inside. It's a building with which I am intimately familiar because I work there. These buildings represent not just different aesthetic sensibilities, they also suggest competing visions about the interface between journalism and the cities and societies that we journalists are supposed to serve. At the risk of slighting my own newspaper, or at least our flagship building, I'd like to make the case for why Norman's model is the wiser and better one for journalism. To do that, I first have to say something about the crisis in American journalism today. As many of you probably know, the American news industry is in steep decline. As recently as 2008, there were approximately 71,000 newsroom jobs in the United States. By 2020, that number had fallen to 31,000. In 2008, close to 50 million Americans, or about 1 in 6, subscribed to a newspaper. Today, that figure is about 20 million, or barely 1 in 20 Americans. The Chicago Tribune has had to sell its headquarters. You'll be pleased to know they've been converted into condos. And it wouldn't surprise me if the paper ceased to publish within a decade, along with once storied names like the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Los Angeles Times. Smaller regional papers are faring even worse, and once famous news magazines like Time and Newsweek barely register in the public mind. The decline of newspapers tracks and corresponds with the erosion of civic knowledge. Let me give you 2 examples. There is now considerable public awareness of increasingly widespread anti-Semitism in the United States, in large part because of the harassment of Jewish students at elite universities. That's not surprising. Many journalists are the products of elite universities and know and report on what is happening on their old campuses. Yet, in the last decade or more, the ultra-Orthodox population in the borough of Brooklyn has been the target of violent physical assaults with little, if any, coverage by most of the major news media. The assaults are so routine that Jews, who constitute barely 2% of the overall American public, account for more than 60% of all religiously motivated hate crimes, and that was before the events of October the 7th. Why the relative lack of attention? I suspect there is a certain amount of unconscious prejudice because Orthodox Jews aren't seen as sympathetic victims by many secular journalists. I also suspect there's some ideological bias because the overwhelming majority of perpetrators of these crimes are young men of color. But the main reason these assaults don't get the attention they deserve is that news coverage of local affairs is in broad and steep decline. A victim both in terms of quantity, of cutbacks in staffing, which leave large holes in coverage, and a victim in terms of quality, of news coverage that increasingly reflects the progressive values and cultural obsessions of many reporters, most of whom come from privileged backgrounds rather than the communities about which they're supposed to write. What is true of the plight of Orthodox Jews is true for many other stories. For instance, if you live in a safe suburb and don't know much about urban crime except what you read in certain major metropolitan newspapers, you might be under the impression that recently, and by recently I mean the last few months, that crime has come down a lot over the last year and returned to its pre-pandemic norms. And if you live in a city and experience urban life every day, that's not what you're hearing and sensing. Why is there such a disparity between what people read about crime and how people experience crime? The reason is this. There was a small decrease in reported crimes in 2022 of about 1.7%. But at the same time, there was a 44% increase in the victimization rate, which is obtained by surveys of over 150,000 households. If you dig a little deeper, you'll discover that in 2021, the FBI changed its data collection policies so that it did not collect data from roughly 40% of police agencies. In the meantime, anyone who lives in a city knows that crimes like carjackings, violent crimes against children, home intrusions, and other forms of property theft are way up. Yet asked to choose between what people experience and what statistics report, news media often prefer the latter, leading to a picture of the world at variance with the way many of us experience it. As my former boss, James Bennett, recently wrote in The Economist, much of the news media is becoming a vehicle, and I quote, through which America's progressive elite talks to itself about an America that does not really exist. Now, it would be wrong to say that old-fashioned, first-rate, shoe-leather city reporting no longer happens. But it happens less, and when it does, it tends to be a lot worse, to the detriment of everyone. Newspapers gradually lose touch with the cities they are meant to serve. Readers gradually lose faith in the newspapers that are meant to serve them. The stock of public ignorance increases. Inevitably, the cycle becomes vicious. In 2023, just 18% of Americans said they had, quote, quite a lot of trust in newspapers, as compared to 45% who have little or none. If any of you are wondering how this 2024 election cycle is going to turn out, consider that point of data. If the loss of civic connection, civic knowledge, and civic trust are consequences of the decline of newspapers, what is the cause of that decline? The question doesn't have a simple answer, and I'm sure social media is largely to blame. But let me suggest three partial explanations. First, newspapers substituted the ideal of authority with the ideal of transparency. Second, they began to be at least as inward-looking as they were outward-looking. And third, they reached for new values while abandoning old ones, instead of trying to anchor the new in the best of the old. What is the ideal of authority? People with long memories here may recall the way Walter Cronkite used to finish his nightly broadcasts as the anchor of CBS News. He would say something like, "That's the way it was Friday, March 6, 1966. In its way, it was a statement of breathtaking arrogance. And yet Cronkite, white-haired and avuncular, conveyed a sense of unimpeachable integrity and judgment. People tended to believe what they saw and heard on the news because they believed him. Without investigating his sources or looking into his footnotes, he seemed like the kind of man whose word was his bond, and that was enough. In more recent years, the trust us model has given way to the check us model. In theory, this should have enhanced confidence in the reliability and trustworthiness of the news. In reality, it has radically diminished it. Why? Because news organizations are like sausages. And the one rule about sausages is that you never want to know how they are really made. Why else? Because transparency turns everyone into a media critic, even if fewer and fewer people are actual media consumers. The second explanation is that the media turned its gaze inward. It wasn't that long ago that using the first-person pronoun was considered a cardinal sin of journalism. These days, it can seem that the news media likes nothing more than to talk about itself, or ourselves. On the very first day that I joined the New York Times from the Wall Street Journal in 2017, I was flabbergasted to get a phone call in my new office from a filmmaker who was in the building making a documentary about the Times. I don't think I was a very good interviewee, and I was relieved when I didn't make the final cut of the movie. But the idea of turning ourselves into the heroes and subjects of our own story struck me as profoundly antithetical to the purpose of journalism. In every room in which a journalist finds him or herself, we should always regard ourselves as the least, not most, interesting person in the room. Finally, there is the question of values. In recent decades, news organizations have made great strides to diversify their workforces, to tell a much wider variety of stories, to appeal to a much broader range of communities. This is all good and necessary. But in the meantime, we have also morphed from tellers of lowercase t truths, meaning accurate, timely, comprehensive, and balanced information, to tellers of a different kind of truth, this time with a capital T, so-called moral truths, or truths in the service of a social justice mission. In other words, instead of attempting to marry the healthiest impulses of our time with the older values of objective journalism, we have too often become ideologues, wearing our points of view on our sleeves, endearing ourselves to those who share our opinions, but profoundly alienating those who do not. Trust in news media has vanished because too often news media has become partisan in today's political and cultural wars. All of which, in conclusion, brings me back to the point of my speech, getting re-invited to Madrid, and that is why Norman's building is better than Renzo's. So let's take a final look at these two buildings. One of the distinguishing features of the New York Times building is that it is almost entirely encased in these ceramic rods, which you can see outside. They keep the building delightfully shaded, shielded, and cool on the inside. Yet for those working inside the building, they obstruct the view of the outside, which is, or always ought to be, the fundamental purpose of all journalism, looking out, not in. The building is inviting and gracious, but the flow of its energy and its gaze is fundamentally inward. That is the core of the New York Times building right there. Once inside, it feels as if you can see everyone else, from the editors-in-chief to the lowliest political columnists. Sometimes you feel you are seeing far too much. Now, look at this tower. The building marries the old and the new, the neoclassical and the modern, giving the sense of an edifice that, like good journalism, looks out unto the city around it. The sky blue of its glass seems to dissolve into the sky, graciously diminishing its own visibility, much as good journalism should diminish our own visibility. And the original stone building at its base and foundation, suggesting a kind of timelessness, is a powerful reminder that the new is at its best when it is firmly anchored in the old. Architecture and journalism are very different professions. I'm not sure what, if anything, an architect can learn about his own craft from a journalist. But thank you, Norman and Elena, and the entire team of the Foster Institute for giving me this extraordinary opportunity to reflect on what a journalist can learn from an architect and the buildings that give shape and meaning to our lives. Thank you.
What a great way to end. I can't guarantee that the ticket's in the post, but I suspect it's mission accomplished, and we'll see you again soon. This brings us to the conclusion of today's event. Can I thank our supporters? Can I thank the scholars and wish them all the best? And to thank the panelists and the contributors to today's event. What can I say? That's how it was on Monday, the 22nd of January, 2024. Thank you.